A racist police officer gets into a confrontation with a black man outside a luxury store, leading to the officer punching the black man and arresting him. Afterwards, he realizes that he has just arrested and assaulted the mayor. Michael Trent stood under the soft glow of a street lamp, adjusting his suit jacket as he waited outside the boutique. The store had been closed for hours, its darkened windows reflecting the empty street. He glanced at his phone, growing impatient as the minutes ticked by. Joshua, his assistant, was running late again. He leaned against the window, checking the street for any sign of Joshua's car, when the heavy sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. "Hey!" a voice barked sharply. Michael looked up, seeing a white police officer walking towards him, his hand resting firmly on his belt. The officer's gaze was sharp, filled with suspicion as he sized up Michael from head to toe. Michael recognized the posture, the look. He'd dealt with it before. "What are you doing here?" the officer demanded, his tone more accusatory than curious. Michael straightened, instinctively slipping his phone back into his pocket. "I'm just waiting for someone," he said evenly. The officer stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the empty street. "Waiting? At this time of night? Outside a closed shop?" "That's right," Michael replied calmly. "My ride is running late." The officer's gaze hardened, his hand inching closer to his flashlight. "Doesn't look right to me. You sure you're not loitering? Maybe up to something else?" Michael felt a flicker of annoyance rise in his chest, but he kept his face composed. "I'm not loitering. I'm just standing here waiting for a ride. Nothing more." The officer's lips curled into a half smile, though it carried no warmth. "Standing around in a suit, huh? What's the occasion? Trying to make yourself look important?" Michael met his gaze, irritation sparking, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm just waiting, officer. There's nothing else going on here." The officer took a step closer, his presence growing more imposing. "Doesn't seem like that to me. You don't exactly blend in around here standing by yourself this late at night. You sure you're not trying to break into something?" Michael felt his pulse quicken. He had been in situations like this before, where explanations didn't matter, and assumptions spoke louder than reason. "There's no need for accusations. I'm not breaking into anything. I told you, I'm waiting for a ride." The officer didn't move, his eyes locked on Michael, daring him to say something more. "You got any ID on you?" Michael's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to give in so easily. "I don't need to show you my ID. I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer's expression darkened, his hand hovering near his belt. "You don't get to decide that. When I ask for ID, you show it. Or is there something you're hiding?" Michael took a deep breath, the frustration now hard to keep in check. "I've told you what I'm doing, and that should be enough. There's no reason for this to go any further." The officer's stance shifted, his voice dropping lower. "I decide how far this goes, not you. And right now, you're giving me a lot of reasons to keep asking questions." Michael clenched his fists, trying to keep his cool. "There's no need for this. I'm not a threat, and I'm not breaking any laws. I'm just waiting." The officer stepped closer, his body now just inches from Michael's. "Funny how you keep saying that, but I'm not convinced. In fact, I'm starting to think you don't belong here at all." Michael's patience was wearing thin. "I have every right to be here." The officer smirked, the tension between them thick in the air. "We'll see about that. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you, until I'm satisfied." The two men stood there, locked in a silent battle. Michael could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the officer's suspicion, the unspoken threats hanging in the air. He glanced up the street again, hoping to see Joshua's car, but the road remained empty. Seconds stretched into minutes as the officer continued to hover, watching, waiting for Michael to make a move. The quiet street felt suffocating, the glow from the street lamp casting long shadows across the pavement. Michael knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The officer's hand rested firmly on his belt, his gaze never leaving Michael's face. "I'll be watching," he muttered, his tone low and threatening. Michael didn't respond, his eyes hardening as he held the officer's gaze. There was nothing more to say, not yet, and so they stood there, two men caught in an unspoken clash, neither willing to back down as the cool night stretched on. Michael stood firm, his body tense, as the officer refused to back off. The minutes stretched on, and still, no sign of Joshua. The tension between the two men was palpable, thick in the air, as if the night itself had been charged with electricity. "I've explained myself," Michael said, his voice controlled, though the frustration was creeping in. "I'm just waiting for someone. There's no reason for this." The officer took a step closer, his hand never leaving the belt where his handcuffs and flashlight rested. "I don't care what you've said," he replied, his voice cold and condescending. "Something about you just doesn't sit right with me." Michael clenched his fists, but kept them at his sides. "What doesn't sit right? The fact that I'm standing here in a suit? Or the fact that you don't think I belong here?" The officer's eyes flashed with anger. "Watch your tone. I'm the one asking questions, not you." Michael's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. You're questioning me for no reason. You've been standing here for 10 minutes. If I were doing something wrong, you'd have figured it out by now. The officer's face twisted into a smirk. Oh, I figured plenty out. Guys like you always think you're too smart to get caught, but you're not. You think I don't see this for what it is? Loitering? Looking for a chance to break into a place like this? Michael couldn't hold back any longer. Loitering? That's what you think this is? I'm waiting for my assistant. That's it. You've been standing here, harassing me, and now you're looking for any excuse to make it worse. The officer's smirk vanished, replaced by a hardened glare. Harassing you? I'm doing my job. Keeping people like you from causing trouble in places like this. Michael stepped forward, his voice cold. People like me? What exactly do you mean by that? You know damn well what I mean, the officer snapped, his voice rising. You think you're slick, standing here all calm like you're innocent. But I've seen this before. A suit doesn't change who you are. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, his anger bubbling over. You don't know a thing about who I am. I know enough, the officer shot back. You're just another punk who thinks he can talk his way out of trouble. Michael took a deep breath, trying to keep control. I haven't done anything wrong. You're the one trying to create trouble where there isn't any. The officer's hand moved toward his cuffs, his eyes narrowing. You're real close to stepping over the line. And what line is that? Michael asked, his voice steady but sharp. The line where I stop letting you bully me for standing on a public sidewalk? The officer's grip tightened on the cuffs. You think you're smart, huh? You think you can mouth off to me? I've got the authority here, not you. Michael's blood boiled, but he held his ground. Authority doesn't give you the right to harass people for no reason. The officer stepped forward, now inches from Michael's face. I don't need a reason if I feel threatened. And right now, I don't like the way you're talking to me. Michael could feel the situation spiraling out of control, the officer's aggression escalating with each word. But he wasn't going to back down. Not this time. You feel threatened? Michael asked, incredulous. I'm standing here, unarmed, waiting for a ride. And you're the one threatening to arrest me. That's not how this works. The officer's jaw clenched, his hand hovering over the cuffs. I'll decide how this works. You're done talking. Michael squared his shoulders, meeting the officer's gaze head on. I'm not done until you stop treating me like a criminal. The officer's eyes blazed with fury, and without another word, he grabbed for the cuffs. That's it. You're under arrest. Michael's heart pounded as he watched the officer's hand move toward him, the cuffs gleaming under the street lamp. This was it. It was happening, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Michael's heart raced as the officer grabbed for the cuffs, the cold steel glinting in the dim light. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. He couldn't let this happen. Not like this. Instinctively, he took a step back, his hands raised. You can't do this, he said, his voice sharp, the anger and fear mixing together. I haven't done anything wrong. The officer's eyes flared, his grip tightening on Michael's arm. You just crossed the line. Don't resist. Michael jerked his arm away, his pulse pounding in his ears. I'm not resisting, but you're not arresting me for no reason. The officer's face twisted with frustration, his hand shooting out again, this time with more force. He caught Michael by the wrist, pulling him forward with a rough yank. You think you're above the law? Think again. Michael tried to pull free, his movements quick but controlled. Get off me. The officer's patience snapped. You want to resist? Fine. His voice dripped with venom as he shoved Michael hard against the boutique window, the glass rattling from the impact. Michael's shoulder slammed into the cold surface, the shock of pain radiating through his body. I said, get off. He struggled to twist free, his muscles tense with the surge of adrenaline. The officer leaned in close, pressing Michael harder against the window, his breath hot on his neck. I told you to stop resisting, the officer growled. Michael's breath came in short bursts as he struggled to push the officer away. His mind raced. How had this escalated so quickly? I'm not resisting. You're the one pushing this too far. The officer's grip tightened, his fingers digging into Michael's arm. That's it. I'm done playing with you. Without warning, the officer swung his fist. The punch landed squarely on Michael's jaw, a hard, brutal impact that sent him reeling. His head snapped to the side, pain exploding across his face as he stumbled against the window. His vision blurred for a moment, the world spinning around him. Michael gasped, his hand instinctively going to his face, the sharp sting of the blow still radiating through his skull. He struggled to steady himself, his mind spinning from the shock. You just had to push it, the officer muttered, his voice cold and unforgiving. He grabbed Michael again, this time slamming him face first into the glass with more force. Now you're gonna learn your lesson. Michael groaned as his chest pressed hard against the window, the rough texture of the officer's hand squeezing his arms behind him. You can't do this. he panted, struggling to find his voice through the haze of pain. "Watch me!" the officer snarled, as he wrenched Michael's arms behind his back. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the metal biting into his skin. Michael's body slumped slightly, his cheek pressed against the cold glass, his mind swimming between pain and disbelief. He tried to turn his head, but the officer's weight kept him pinned, his breath shallow and labored. "On the ground," the officer ordered, pulling him back from the window and shoving him toward the pavement. Michael stumbled, barely managing to catch himself before his knees hit the ground. He was panting now, his face throbbing where the officer's fist had struck him. His thoughts spun wildly, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. How had it come to this? He'd done nothing wrong, and now he was cuffed on the ground, assaulted by the very people meant to protect him. The officer stood over him, his chest rising and falling with his own pent-up rage. "Maybe next time you'll think twice about resisting arrest." Michael looked up at him, his vision still swimming, but his voice came out firm, though laced with pain. "You're going to regret this." The officer sneered, towering over him with the cuffs now secured. "Not as much as you will." As the night air pressed down on them, Michael knew this was far from over. This was just the beginning. Michael felt the tight grip of the handcuffs bite into his wrists as the officer roughly pushed him toward the patrol car. His jaw still throbbed from the punch, his body tense from the confrontation. But beneath the pain and tension, a calmness began to settle over him. He knew something the officer didn't, and that knowledge gave him the upper hand. The officer, still brimming with self-satisfaction, moved toward the car, opening the back door with a sharp tug. "Get in," he ordered, his voice cold and full of authority. "I warned you not to resist." Michael didn't move. Instead, he straightened himself, took a deep breath, and with a quiet, almost smug smile said, "Before you throw me in that car, why don't you check my ID?" The officer froze, his hand still on the door, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Michael's smile grew ever so slightly. "You heard me. Check my ID. It's in my wallet." The officer hesitated, narrowing his eyes as if trying to decide whether this was some sort of trick. "You've had plenty of time to give me your ID. Now, you want to cooperate?" Michael met his gaze, his voice calm and laced with quiet confidence. "Check it. You're going to want to know who you've just cuffed before this gets worse for you." The officer's confidence faltered, but he still wasn't fully buying it. "Fine. Let's see what you've got," he muttered, reaching into Michael's pocket and pulling out his wallet. With a flick of his wrist, the officer opened it and pulled out the ID card. For a moment, he squinted at it, his expression unreadable. But as he processed the information, the color drained from his face. The name, the title, everything clicked into place. His eyes darted from the ID back to Michael, disbelief and panic flashing across his features. That's right," Michael said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "I'm the mayor of this city." The officer's face went pale, the full weight of what he had just done sinking in. He looked back at the ID as if hoping it would change, but it didn't. The realization hit him hard. He had just assaulted and arrested the highest-ranking official in the city. The officer's hands trembled as he fumbled with the cuffs, his previous aggression gone, replaced by panic. "Sir, I didn't know. I didn't realize." Michael cut him off, his voice still calm but now sharper, more commanding. "You didn't realize because you assumed. You let your prejudice blind you, and now you're in a situation you can't talk your way out of." The officer's face flushed with embarrassment and fear as he hurriedly unlocked the cuffs, freeing Michael's wrists. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean." "Didn't mean?" Michael's voice rose slightly as he rubbed his sore wrists, his eyes blazing with restrained fury. "You didn't mean to punch me? You didn't mean to throw me up against that window and treat me like a criminal?" The officer stumbled over his words, trying to find some way to salvage the situation. "Sir, I thought you were—" "You thought," Michael snapped, cutting him off again. "That's the problem. You didn't think. You saw me standing here, and because I didn't fit into your idea of who should be in this neighborhood, you decided I was a threat. That's what you did." The officer stammered, backing up slightly as Michael stepped forward, his voice firm and unforgiving. "Do you have any idea what kind of situation you've put yourself in? Do you understand the consequences of your actions tonight?" The officer's eyes were wide with fear now. "Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far." You didn't mean for it to go this far?" Michael's voice was cold, his words slicing through the officer's weak defense. "This is exactly what happens when you let your bias dictate your actions. You're supposed to serve and protect, not assault and profile." The officer swallowed hard, his face pale, his hands still shaking. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Michael's voice was low, controlled, but deadly serious. "You think that's going to fix this? You think an apology is enough to make up for what you just did? The officer couldn't meet Michael's eyes, his whole demeanor collapsing under the weight of his realization. Michael took a step back, letting out a long breath. I want your badge number. Now. The officer fumbled to provide the number, his voice barely a whisper as he recited it. Michael took out his phone, jotting it down calmly before looking the officer in the eye one last time. You'll be hearing from me again, Michael said, his tone final. And next time, you won't be getting off so easily. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the officer standing there, paralyzed with fear and regret. As Michael walked down the empty street, his mind was already racing ahead. This incident wasn't just personal. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one he was in a position to finally address head-on. And after tonight, that change was going to happen, one way or another. Michael walked briskly down the street, the weight of the night's events settling heavily on his shoulders. His jaw still ached from the officer's punch, and the faint sting of the handcuffs lingered on his wrists. But more than the physical pain, it was the anger bubbling beneath the surface that fueled his steps. He couldn't let this slide. As he turned the corner, away from the scene, he pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline still coursing through him. He dialed quickly, the familiar number ringing in his ear. After a few rings, a voice answered. Joshua, Michael said, his voice clipped and direct. I need you to meet me at City Hall, now. Joshua's voice came through, confused but concerned. What happened? I was just about to... I'll explain when you get there, Michael interrupted. Just get there as soon as you can. Without waiting for a response, Michael ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. His mind raced as he made his way toward City Hall, the lights of the city casting long shadows on the quiet streets. The officer's smug face flashed in his memory. But more than that, the image of his own reflection in the glass window, pinned, bruised, humiliated, stuck with him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what this represented. The unchecked power, the blatant profiling, the disregard for basic respect. It was all too familiar. And as mayor, he had the power to do something about it. By the time he reached City Hall, Joshua was already waiting outside, his face drawn with concern. What happened? You sounded off on the phone. Michael sighed, taking a moment to steady his thoughts before answering. I was harassed and assaulted by one of our own officers tonight. I was almost arrested. Joshua's eyes widened in shock. What? Are you serious? Michael nodded grimly. Dead serious. He didn't know who I was, just assumed I was up to no good because I was standing in a rich part of town at night. Joshua shook his head, disbelief written across his face. I don't even know what to say. What are we going to do? We're going to act, Michael said firmly. I'm done letting this kind of thing slide. I've been talking about reform for too long. Now I have the proof. This isn't just some abstract problem. It happened to me. Joshua looked at him, his eyes serious. So what's the plan? Michael's mind was already working through the details. First, we're filing a formal complaint against the officer. I have his badge number. Then we're taking this up with the police chief. This has to be handled at the highest level. I'm going to make sure this officer faces the consequences of his actions. And beyond that? Joshua asked. What about the broader issue? Michael's jaw tightened as he remembered the officer's sneering face, the casual violence with which he had treated him. This is going to be the catalyst. I've been pushing for reform in the department for months, but now I have the leverage I need. We're going to take this public if we have to. The community needs to know that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated anymore. Joshua nodded, his expression serious. I'm with you, whatever you need. Good, Michael said, because this isn't going to be easy. The department will push back, and the officer will try to spin this any way he can, but we're not backing down. Joshua looked at him for a moment, then asked quietly, Are you okay though? I mean, physically? Michael touched his jaw, wincing slightly at the lingering pain. I'll be fine. It's not the first time I've taken a hit, but it's bigger than that. We have to make sure this never happens again, to anyone. Joshua nodded, his face grim. All right, let's get to work. As they entered City Hall, Michael felt the weight of the night's events settle into purpose. This was his moment to act, to turn the injustice he'd faced into the fuel for the change the city desperately needed. The officer's smug face and careless actions were a reminder of the systemic problems he'd been trying to fight for years. But now, it was personal, and he wasn't going to let it go. This time, things were going to change. The next day, Michael walked into the police precinct, his jaw still sore from the previous night's assault. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the tile floor. Joshua followed close behind, his face set with a determined expression. They moved with purpose toward the front desk, where an officer glanced up from his paperwork, immediately recognizing Michael. I'm here to see Chief Harlan, Michael said firmly, his voice controlled but calm. The officer hesitated, casting a nervous glance toward Michael's bruised face. Yes, sir. I'll let him know you're here. He quickly picked up the phone, relaying the message. Within minutes, Police Chief Harlan appeared from his office at the back of the station. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. His eyes quickly flicked to Michael's bruised jaw, and his expression became more serious. "Mr. Trent," Harlan said, extending a hand, which Michael ignored. "Come to my office. We need to discuss what happened." Without waiting for a response, Harlan turned and led them down a long hallway, his steps heavy with authority. They reached his office, and as the door closed behind them, the room grew tense. Harlan gestured toward the chairs in front of his desk, but Michael remained standing. "I understand there was an incident last night," Chief Harlan said, his voice neutral, though there was a hint of defensiveness. "Incident?" Michael repeated, his voice sharp. "I was harassed and assaulted by one of your officers. I was nearly arrested for standing on a sidewalk, and you're calling it an incident?" Before Harlan could respond, the door opened, and Officer Greg Mason walked in, his face pale and tight. He glanced nervously at Michael but quickly looked away. "Officer Mason," Harlan said, motioning to a chair. "We need to clear this up." Mason sat down, his body stiff. His bravado from the previous night was gone, replaced by nervousness as the weight of his actions began to sink in. He glanced at Harlan, then back at Michael, unable to maintain eye contact. Michael took a step forward, his eyes locked on Mason. "Tell me, Officer Mason, what exactly were you thinking last night when you decided to ignore everything I said and escalated a situation that didn't need to be anything more than a conversation?" Mason shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I didn't know who you were. You thought, Michael interrupted, his voice icy. "You thought you had the right to treat me like a criminal because I didn't fit your idea of who should be standing in that neighborhood at night. You didn't care about the truth." Chief Harlan's expression hardened as he turned to Mason. "Officer Mason, you're aware that this behavior is unacceptable. Why didn't you de-escalate the situation?" Mason's eyes flicked between Harlan and Michael. "I made a mistake," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know." "You didn't know?" Michael's voice rose. "You didn't know because you didn't care to find out. You let your prejudice dictate your actions, and when I called you out on it, you responded with violence." Mason swallowed hard, his face pale. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Sorry isn't going to fix this," Michael said, his voice sharp. "You need to understand what you did. You didn't just assault me. You violated your oath. You're supposed to protect and serve this community, not terrorize it." Harlan nodded, his tone more serious now. "Officer Mason, you've crossed a line, and there will be consequences. I've already placed you on suspension pending an internal investigation." Mason opened his mouth to respond, but Harlan's cold gaze silenced him. He looked back at Michael, his face pale and remorseful, but it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. Michael turned to Harlan, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about one officer's behavior. This is about a culture in your department that allows officers like Mason to think they can get away with this. He didn't see me as a person. He saw me as a threat. And that's a systemic issue, one that needs to be addressed now." Harlan's face tightened, but he nodded slowly. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Trent, and I'm committed to addressing this situation." Michael crossed his arms, his expression unrelenting. "Addressing it? This needs more than just an internal investigation. This needs to be public. People need to know that this department is taking real steps to reform. I want a full report made public. Transparency, accountability." Chief Harlan's face hardened slightly, but he kept his tone measured. "We'll make sure the investigation is thorough, and appropriate action will be taken." Michael took a step closer to Harlan's desk, his voice lowering but filled with purpose. "This is bigger than one incident, Chief. This is about the future of this department. If real reforms don't happen, I'll make sure the public knows what's going on. This city deserves better." Harlan held Michael's gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. "Understood." Michael turned to Mason one last time, his voice quieter but no less forceful. "You thought you could get away with this because you assumed you had all the power. But now, you know you don't. And there will be consequences for your actions." Mason didn't respond. He couldn't even meet Michael's gaze. Without another word, Michael turned and left the office, Joshua following closely behind. The air outside felt lighter, but Michael knew this wasn't over. The fight for justice and reform had just begun, and this time, he wouldn't stop until the changes were made. As they exited the precinct, Michael knew that the momentum was finally on his side. Now it was time to make sure the system changed, for good. Michael left the precinct with a clear mind, his steps steady as he and Joshua made their way to the car. The cold morning air filled his lungs as he breathed in deeply, processing the enormity of what had just transpired. He had put the wheels of accountability in motion, but this was only the beginning. Reform, real change, was going to take more than one meeting with the police chief. Joshua broke the silence as they reached the car. "Do you think they'll follow through?" "They'll have to," Michael said, sliding into the driver's seat. "This isn't something they can sweep under the rug. Not this time." Joshua nodded but still looked concerned. "What if they make Mason the scapegoat? Suspend him, maybe even fire him, but nothing else changes." Michael tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "That's not going to happen. We're not giving them that option." As they drove through the city, Michael's thoughts raced. The weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him, but it also fueled him. This wasn't just about last night. It was about the broken system that had put him in that situation. His reform agenda couldn't wait any longer. Joshua glanced at him, worry still creasing his brow. "We need to get ahead of this. Once people hear what happened, the story's going to explode. We need to be in control of the narrative." Michael nodded. "We'll go public, but on our terms. The people need to hear the truth, and I'll make sure they get it directly from me." By the time they reached City Hall, Michael had already formulated a plan. He moved quickly to his office, his mind locked on what needed to happen next. "Get the press ready," Michael said as he sat at his desk, glancing at the clock. "I want to hold a press conference this afternoon. No delays. We'll outline what happened, the steps we're taking, and make it clear that there will be transparency in this investigation." Joshua nodded, already dialing his phone. "Are you going to tell them everything?" Michael hesitated, thinking through the details. "Yes, they need to know the full truth. We can't gloss over this." Joshua paused, his phone in hand. "You're going to name the officer?" "Not yet," Michael said. "The investigation still needs to happen, but I'll make it clear what he did and how wrong it was." Within hours, the media gathered outside City Hall. Reporters, news cameras, and members of the public filled the space in front of the building, all waiting for Michael to speak. He could feel the tension building, the city already buzzing with speculation. Joshua walked into his office, phone in hand. "We're all set. The press is waiting. Are you sure you want to lay everything out?" Michael adjusted his tie in the mirror, his jaw still bruised. "It's the only way to make sure they understand how serious this is." Joshua nodded. "Let's do this." As Michael stepped out of City Hall and approached the podium, the crowd quieted. Cameras flashed, microphones were held high, and all eyes were on him. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "Good afternoon," Michael began, his voice calm but resolute. "I've called this press conference today to address an incident that occurred last night involving one of our city's police officers and myself." The crowd stirred, the tension rising as people leaned in to hear more. "Last night I was standing outside a store waiting for a ride when I was approached by an officer on patrol. Despite my calm explanation of why I was there, the officer became increasingly aggressive. He made assumptions about who I was and why I was there." Michael paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "He accused me of loitering, of being up to no good, simply because I didn't fit his idea of who should be in that neighborhood. When I calmly tried to explain myself, the situation escalated. He punched me, handcuffed me, and was about to throw me in the back of his patrol car." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the shock of his words sinking in. "At no point did I resist," Michael continued, his voice rising with conviction. "I was calm, clear, and respectful, but that didn't matter. What mattered to him was what he saw when he looked at me. Not the words coming out of my mouth, not my explanations. He saw a threat, and he acted on that assumption." Michael glanced at Joshua, who gave him a nod of encouragement. He turned back to the crowd, his voice steady but impassioned. "It wasn't until I told him to check my ID that he realized who I was. At that moment, everything changed. The panic set in. He uncuffed me, stammering apologies, realizing the mistake he had made. But the mistake wasn't just about me. This is about the systemic issues in our police department." He leaned forward slightly, gripping the sides of the podium. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a culture that allows these assumptions to be made. It's about a system that allows people to be treated as suspects, based on their appearance, rather than their actions. This is what we've been fighting to change." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "There will be a full investigation into the actions of this officer," Michael continued, "and I will personally ensure that the investigation is transparent. The people of this city deserve to know what happens in their police department, and I won't let this be another story that fades into the background." Michael paused again, locking eyes with the cameras. "But this is bigger than one incident. This is about making real lasting changes in our police department. I've been fighting for police reform for years, and last night I experienced firsthand why that fight is necessary. No one, No one should be treated the way I was treated last night. Reporters began shouting questions, their voices rising in the crowd. Michael held up his hand, silencing them. There will be more to say as the investigation moves forward, but let me make one thing clear. This is not the end. This is the beginning of real change. I will not stop until every person in this city, no matter who they are, no matter where they're from, can trust that they will be treated fairly and with respect by the very people sworn to protect them. With that, Michael stepped away from the podium. Joshua met him at the bottom of the steps, his expression serious. That was intense, Joshua said quietly. But you did what needed to be done. Michael nodded. It's time for this city to wake up. We've talked about reform long enough. Now, it's time to make it happen. As they walked back into City Hall, Michael felt the burden of leadership more acutely than ever. But he also felt something else, a renewed sense of purpose. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Now, it was up to him to push for the reforms the city desperately needed. This time, he wouldn't stop until the system changed for good. Michael sat in his office at City Hall, staring out of the large windows overlooking the city. The press conference had shaken the city's leadership, and the phone had been ringing nonstop since he stepped off that podium. Calls from council members, local organizations, and even from his constituents flooded in, everyone wanting to know more, to express their outrage or support, or to demand faster action. The city was waking up, but the challenge ahead was daunting. Joshua entered the office, his phone in hand. You've been getting a lot of attention. Social media's buzzing, and the press is covering the story nonstop. Michael sighed and rubbed his temples. Good. We need to keep the pressure on. I want people to understand how serious this is. Joshua nodded, stepping closer to the desk. I've spoken to some community leaders, and they're ready to support you, but they're also expecting something concrete. They want to know what reforms you'll be pushing for. Michael nodded slowly, his mind already racing. We need to start with the investigation into Officer Mason, but that's just the first step. We need real systemic changes, more oversight, better training, and stricter accountability measures. Joshua's expression was serious. I agree, but you know the police union will fight this tooth and nail. They're already pushing back against your public statements, saying you're jumping the gun. I don't care what the union says, Michael replied, his voice firm. If they're not willing to reform from within, then we'll push from the outside. This isn't going away. Before Joshua could respond, there was a knock on the door, and Michael's assistant stepped in. Mr. Trent, the police chief is here to see you. Michael exchanged a quick glance with Joshua before nodding. Send him in. Chief Harlan entered, his usual confident stride now more measured. He offered a tight-lipped nod to both men before sitting down across from Michael's desk. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence as Harlan's gaze met Michael's. Mr. Trent, Harlan began, his tone polite but with an edge of defensiveness. I've seen the coverage of the press conference. I understand why you felt the need to go public, but we need to discuss how we move forward from here. Michael leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. What's there to discuss? The officer's actions were inexcusable. The investigation needs to move quickly, and there must be consequences. Harlan shifted in his seat. I agree that Officer Mason's actions warrant a thorough investigation, and we've already suspended him pending the outcome. But you understand that these things take time. We can't rush to judgment. Michael's expression hardened. I'm not asking for a rushed judgment, Chief. I'm asking for accountability. The public needs to know that this is being handled transparently, and that means no delays, no excuses. Harlan frowned slightly. I've served this department for over 30 years. I know the community's trust is fragile right now, but we also have to ensure we follow the proper procedures. Michael took a deep breath, his voice calm but insistent. Chief, this isn't just about procedures. This is about rebuilding trust that's already been broken. Officer Mason's actions are part of a larger problem, and you know it. I've had complaints come across my desk for years, claims of racial profiling, unnecessary force, and most of them go unaddressed. Harlan's jaw clenched. I'm aware of the issues, but sweeping changes can't happen overnight. I'm not asking for overnight changes, Michael said, his voice rising slightly. But we can't sit on our hands while this department loses the faith of the very people it's supposed to protect. The time for small incremental fixes is over. We need comprehensive reform, and we need it now. Harlan met Michael's gaze, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. What exactly are you proposing? Michael sat back, his mind quickly organizing his thoughts. First, we need to establish an independent oversight committee, something outside the department to review complaints of misconduct and make recommendations for discipline. Second, I want mandatory de-escalation training for every officer in the force, with specific training on racial bias. And third, There must be a public reporting system where residents can see the progress of complaints and investigations. Harlan raised an eyebrow. An independent oversight committee? You know the union will push back hard on that. Michael nodded. Let them push, but this is non-negotiable. People need to see that there's accountability, that the department isn't protecting its own at the expense of the community. We can't let internal investigations continue to be handled quietly behind closed doors. Harlan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You're asking for a lot. I'm asking for what's necessary, Michael replied firmly. This isn't just about making changes to fix what happened to me. It's about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Harlan looked down for a moment, clearly weighing his options. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. I understand your position, and I agree that changes are needed. I'll bring this to the department, but you need to be prepared for a fight. Not just from the union, but from officers who feel like they're being targeted. Michael leaned forward again, his eyes locked on Harlan. This isn't about targeting anyone. This is about making the police force better. If any officer feels threatened by accountability, then maybe they shouldn't be on the force in the first place. Harlan's lips thinned, but he nodded. I'll take your proposals to the department leadership. We'll see what we can do. As Harlan stood to leave, Michael remained seated, watching him closely. Remember, Chief, Michael said quietly, the eyes of the city are on us right now. Don't let this opportunity for change slip away. Harlan paused at the door, turning back to Michael. I won't, he said, his tone more sincere than before. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not. When Harlan left, the room fell quiet, and Joshua exhaled sharply. You think he'll actually go through with it? Michael rubbed his jaw, still tender from the night before. He'll have to. We've come too far to let this fall apart now. Joshua nodded, pacing slightly. So, what's next? Michael stood up, walking over to the window and looking out over the city. Next, we keep pushing. We rally the community, we stay visible, and we keep the pressure on until real reforms are in place. This isn't just about one bad officer, it's about changing a system. Joshua crossed his arms, a hint of a smile on his face. I think you're ready for that fight. Michael smiled grimly. I've been ready for a long time. As the sun began to set over the city, Michael knew the fight was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like victory. Real, lasting change was finally within reach. The following day, Michael wasted no time moving his agenda forward. The press conference had sparked a wave of conversations throughout the city, on the streets, in offices, and on every news outlet. The pressure on the police department was intensifying, and Michael knew it wouldn't be long before the resistance from the union and department leadership reached full force. He stood in the mayor's office, staring down at a stack of paperwork that outlined his proposals for reform. Joshua entered the room, his expression tense but focused. I've just gotten off the phone with a few council members. The public's backing your reforms, but there's pushback from the usual suspects. Michael nodded. I expected that. Who's pushing hardest? Joshua sighed. Some of the council members who are in close ties with the police union are being cautious. They're worried about the political blowback. We don't have time for cautious, Michael said firmly. This isn't about politics. This is about real change. Right. But they're politicians. They'll protect their own interests first. Michael glanced at his watch. We need to get these proposals in front of the council today. If we wait any longer, the momentum dies. Joshua pulled out his tablet. The police chief just issued a statement. He's backing the investigation, but said that the police department can't allow reforms to weaken the ability of officers to do their job. Michael's jaw tightened. That's code for we're going to stall. Joshua nodded. Exactly. But the community's rallying. I've been getting calls from advocacy groups and local leaders all morning. People want action. Then we give them action, Michael replied. Set up a meeting with the council and the police union leadership. We'll hash this out. Within hours, Michael was standing in a packed meeting room at City Hall. The atmosphere was thick with tension. On one side sat several city council members, their expressions ranging from cautious to supportive. Across from them sat representatives from the police union, along with Chief Harlan. The police union president, a stocky man with a stern face, sat with his arms crossed, glaring at Michael from across the room. The meeting began with formalities, but Michael quickly cut to the chase. We're not here to debate the need for reform, he said, his voice clear and steady. The people of this city have spoken, and they want accountability. The system as it stands is broken, and we have an obligation to fix it. The union president shifted in his seat. Mayor Trent, we've always worked closely with the city, but some of these reforms you're proposing, they'll tie the hands of our officers. We can't allow that. Michael leaned forward. This isn't about tying anyone's hands. It's about ensuring that officers are held to the standards we expect from those entrusted with protecting the public. If accountability weakens your force, then that's a problem with the force, not the reforms. Chief Harlan cleared his throat. We support improving training, especially around de-escalation tactics. But the Oversight Committee is going to cause major friction. Officers are going to feel like they're constantly being second-guessed by people who don't understand the dangers they face. Michael shot him a hard look. We're talking about people who don't trust that your department will investigate misconduct fairly. The public needs a system they can believe in. And right now, they don't. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, Councilwoman Green, leaned forward. I agree with the mayor. If the public can't trust the police to hold their own accountable, we'll never restore confidence in law enforcement. The union president's face reddened. You're not out there on the streets. Our officers are risking their lives every day. You sit behind desks and think you know what it's like. Michael's voice was cool. What I know is that this city can't afford another incident like the one that happened to me, or worse. Every day we delay these reforms. We're putting lives at risk. The room went silent for a moment. Chief Harlan finally spoke again, more measured this time. What exactly are you proposing? Michael listed the reforms swiftly, not wanting to leave any room for delay. The Independent Oversight Committee, mandatory racial bias and de-escalation training, public reporting of complaints, and increased accountability for officers who engage in racial profiling or unnecessary force. This isn't just about making the department look better, Michael said. This is about making it better. The union president stood up, clearly furious. You're going to destroy morale. Our officers already feel like they're under siege. Michael didn't flinch. Morale isn't the issue when people are being unjustly harassed, profiled, or worse. The system will improve when the officers who truly want to serve and protect are able to do so in a department that holds everyone accountable. The tension in the room thickened as the union representatives whispered among themselves. After a long pause, one of the council members spoke up. We should take this to a vote. We've heard enough. An hour later, the council had agreed to move forward with Michael's reform package. It was a victory, but Michael knew it was only the beginning. As he left the meeting room, Joshua caught up with him. Well, that wasn't easy, but we got what we needed. For now, Michael said. But the union's not going to take this lying down. We need to prepare for their next move. Joshua nodded. What's next? Michael glanced at his phone, already thinking ahead. Next, we focus on the investigation, and we keep pushing, harder than ever. The wheels of reform were in motion, but Michael knew the real fight was just beginning. Days had passed since the city council agreed to move forward with Michael's reform package, but the process was slow, too slow. The police union was doing everything it could to stall the investigation into Officer Mason, and Chief Harlan had become increasingly unresponsive. Every step forward seemed to be met with new delays, and Michael could feel the pressure building from the community. He knew the public wouldn't wait forever, and neither would he. Sitting in his office, Michael reviewed the latest updates on the investigation, or rather, the lack of updates. Nothing was moving. The department's internal review had stalled under bureaucratic excuses, and Mason's name still hadn't been made public. Joshua entered the room looking frustrated. They're dragging their feet, Mike. The investigation should have been moving by now, but Harlan's people are tying it up in red tape. They're trying to run out the clock. Michael clenched his jaw, his fingers tapping the desk. I knew they'd stall, but this is worse than I expected. The community's getting restless. Joshua nodded. You're right. I've had calls from reporters and local leaders all day asking for updates. People are asking why the officer's name hasn't been released. Michael leaned back in his chair, weighing the options. He had wanted to let the official investigation take its course, but it was clear now that the department was doing everything it could to slow things down. If he waited any longer, the public's trust, already fragile, would evaporate entirely. I'm not waiting anymore, Michael said, his voice firm. If they won't move, we will. It's time to release the officer's name. Joshua's eyes widened slightly. You're sure about that? You know what kind of blowback you'll get. Michael stood up, pacing the room. The people deserve to know who was responsible for what happened to me. The department's trying to protect him, and that's exactly why we're stuck in this mess. They think they can hide behind procedure, but not anymore. Joshua nodded, already pulling out his phone. I'll set up a press release. The media will be all over this. Good, Michael said. Let them be. I'm not going to let Harlan or the union keep stalling while this city waits for justice. Within an hour, Michael was standing at a podium outside City Hall. The press gathered once again. Reporters crowded in close, microphones thrust toward him, the air buzzing with anticipation. Michael looked out at the crowd, his face set with determination. Good afternoon. As many of you know, we have been working on reforms to address the issues within our police department. But despite the commitments made by the department and the city council, the investigation into the actions of Officer Greg Mason has been repeatedly stalled. Enough is enough. The crowd quieted, the tension palpable. I've waited patiently for the police department to move forward with this investigation, Michael continued. But the delays have gone on long enough. Today, I'm releasing the name of the officer involved in the incident that occurred last week. His name is Greg Mason, and he is the officer who wrongfully detained and assaulted me. A murmur rippled through the crowd as reporters began scribbling notes and snapping photos. This isn't just about me, Michael said, his voice rising with conviction. This is about accountability. The people of this city deserve transparency, and they deserve to know who is responsible when misconduct occurs. Officer Mason's actions were unacceptable, and the public has a right to know his name. We will not allow the department to shield him or delay justice. The questions from the reporters came fast and furious, but Michael wasn't done yet. I want to make something else clear, he said, his eyes locked on the cameras. This is not just about one officer. This is about a system that has allowed officers like Mason to act without consequences for far too long. We are pushing for real reform, and I will not stop until this city sees the changes it deserves. As Michael stepped away from the podium, the buzz from the press intensified. Joshua caught up with him as they walked back into City Hall. That was bold, Joshua said, but necessary. Michael nodded, his mind already racing ahead. It was the only move we had left. Harlan and the union won't be able to hide behind the investigation anymore. They'll have to answer for this. Within hours of the press conference, the media was flooded with stories about Officer Mason. His name splashed across every major outlet. The community response was immediate. Protests began forming outside the police station, and calls for action grew louder. But the biggest shock came later that afternoon. Joshua burst into Michael's office, breathless. Harlan just stepped down. Michael looked up, surprised. What? Chief Harlan resigned, Joshua repeated. The pressure must have been too much. He just made a statement saying he's stepping down effective immediately. He didn't want to be at the center of this anymore. Michael leaned back in his chair, processing the news. He had expected resistance, not retreat. But this was a victory, even if it came sooner than anticipated. The department's in chaos right now, Joshua continued. The union's scrambling and the community's demanding answers. Michael nodded slowly. Good. Now we move forward even faster. No more stalling. The resignation of the police chief was a turning point, and Michael knew it. With Harlan gone, the department was vulnerable, and the momentum for reform was finally in his favor. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, it felt like real change was within reach. With Chief Harlan's resignation still rippling through the city, Michael wasted no time pushing forward. The police department was under scrutiny, like never before, and now, more than ever, the city needed decisive action. The next major step would be the Internal Review Board's decision on Officer Greg Mason. But this time, Michael wasn't content to sit on the sidelines. As Michael stood in his office reviewing the latest reports, Joshua entered with an update. The Review Board's meeting is set for next week, he said, handing Michael a folder. They're going to decide on Mason's future with the department. Michael barely glanced at the folder. I want in on that meeting. Joshua blinked, taken aback. You want to sit on the Review Board? They're not going to like that. The board's supposed to be internal. Just the department and union reps. That's exactly the problem, Michael replied, his voice sharp. I've seen how internal investigations go. They drag it out, debate the consequences, and then slap the officer on the wrist. Not this time. I want to be in that room. I want to see how they justify keeping a man like Mason on the force. Joshua hesitated. You're the mayor. You've got the influence to push for this, but you know they'll push back. The union, especially. They'll see it as you overstepping. Michael nodded, already moving toward his desk to make the call. Let them push, but I'm going to be in that room, and Mason's days in this department are over. By the next morning, Michael had formally requested to sit in on the review board meeting. The backlash was immediate. The union president, as expected, went on the offensive, calling Michael's request a violation of the department's procedures and an unprecedented political overreach. Several high-ranking officers within the department echoed the sentiment, but Michael didn't care. The public was on his side, and so were the city's community leaders. The pressure to reform was stronger than ever, and if there was one thing Michael was sure of, it was that this was the moment to strike. The day of the review board meeting arrived quickly. Michael entered the conference room, where the board had already gathered. It was a small private space with a long table at the center. Around it sat members of the police review board, senior officers, a union representative, and a legal advisor. Greg Mason sat at the end of the table, his face pale but defiant. Michael could feel the tension in the air as he took his seat. The head of the review board, Captain Reynolds, cleared his throat and spoke, his tone measured. Mayor Trent, I understand you've requested to observe the proceedings today. Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on Mason. I'm here because the people of this city demand accountability. Officer Mason's actions were a gross violation of the trust placed in him by the public. I want to ensure that this board makes the right decision. Reynolds looked uneasy but continued. We're aware of the public interest in this case. However, as you know, these proceedings are typically handled internally. We're here to review Officer Mason's conduct and determine whether disciplinary action, up to and including termination, is warranted. Michael leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. With all due respect, this case goes beyond typical internal matters. Officer Mason didn't just violate procedure, he abused his authority. He assaulted me and nearly arrested me without cause, simply because of his biases. This isn't just about department policy. It's about the integrity of the entire force. Mason, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice defensive. I did what I had to do. You were standing out there late at night not answering my questions. I was following my training. Michael turned his gaze toward Mason, his expression hard. Your training didn't tell you to ignore what I was saying. Your training didn't tell you to escalate the situation without reason. This isn't about procedure. It's about your assumptions. Mason shifted uncomfortably, his voice tight. I've dealt with plenty of situations where someone says they're just waiting for a ride and ends up being a criminal. I made a call, and you made the wrong call. Michael shot back. You made a call based on who I am, not what I was doing. That's the difference. The room fell silent for a moment as Captain Reynolds looked between Michael and Mason, then addressed the room. We'll now hear statements from Officer Mason and review the findings of the internal investigation. As the meeting continued, the board reviewed the evidence against Mason, his actions that night, the body camera footage, and witness testimony. The case against him was overwhelming. Michael remained silent for most of the proceedings, but every time Mason tried to justify his actions, Michael felt his anger rise. Finally, after hours of discussion, Captain Reynolds turned to Michael. Mayor Trent, before we conclude, is there anything else you'd like to say? Michael stood, his eyes locking on Mason. I've heard enough excuses from Officer Mason today. He's refused to take accountability for his actions, and that tells me everything I need to know. The people of this city deserve better. They deserve a police force they can trust, one that serves and protects everyone, without prejudice. Keeping Officer Mason on this force would be a stain on this department's reputation. He must be terminated. Mason scowled, his voice low. You're making me out to be a monster. I didn't wake up that day planning to arrest anyone. I was doing my job. If that's what you think your job is, then you should never have worn that badge in the first place, Michael replied coldly. Captain Reynolds nodded, looking around the room. The board will now deliberate. An hour later, the board returned with their decision. Captain Reynolds spoke clearly, his voice steady. After reviewing the evidence and hearing all statements, the board has decided that Officer Greg Mason's actions were in violation of department policy. His conduct was unprofessional and unacceptable. Officer Mason is hereby terminated from the police department, effective immediately. Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he kept his expression neutral as Mason stood, visibly shaken. The former officer didn't make eye contact with anyone as he left the room. Captain Reynolds turned to Michael. Thank you for being here, Mayor Trent. We understand this was an important decision for the city. Michael nodded, his voice calm but resolute. This was the right decision. But this is just the beginning. The people of this city are watching, and we need to continue pushing for the reforms that will prevent this from ever happening again. As Michael left the room, Joshua met him in the hallway, a look of satisfaction on his face. It's done. Mason's gone, Michael nodded. It's a victory, but there's still more to do. We need to make sure the reforms go through. Joshua smiled. One battle at a time, Mike, but you've made history today. Michael glanced back at the door to the review board's room, feeling the weight of the moment. Maybe, but we've got a lot more battles ahead of us. As they walked out of City Hall, Michael knew that while Mason was gone, the fight for real change had only just begun. This victory was significant, but there were still deep-rooted issues within the department that needed to be addressed. The road to reform was long, but Michael was ready to lead the way.